I'm gonna take it away. Hello, everyone. It is Monday, November 30th, 2020. This is the first bi-weekly reoccurring meeting of the Inclusive Naming Initiative. My name is Celeste Horgan. I'm a senior technical writer at the Linux Foundation / the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and I will be your host for today. The note taker today will be Bill Mulligan, who is a marketing manager at the CNCF. Though I'm going to quickly add to our agenda. We will be asking for volunteers for note taker for next week, or for the next occurrence of this meeting in 2 weeks' time. Ooh, my pronouns are she, her. Thank you so much for asking, Roger. Thank you all for joining us, first off. If this were a Kubernetes meeting, I would normally tell you all that we are abiding by the code of conduct. This is not an official Kubernetes meeting, so I can't say that. However, please be very kind to each other and endeavor to be as wonderful as possible. And we will work on our meeting agreements for the next round. So we don't have much of an agenda for this meeting, but I think what Priyanka would like us to do, and she is very deservedly on vacation today, is to continue taking suggestions from the crowd and to continue the discussion that we started last time in terms of suggestions as to what we'd like to see this group do and what we think this group's priorities are. So just to kind of refresh everyone's memories, though, if you are looking at the agenda doc, which one more time, just for fun, into the chat. If you're looking at the agenda doc, you can scroll down. But to refresh everybody's memories, and for the people who didn't join us, this initiative is looking to be a cross-organizational, industry-wide initiative to align on replacement language and replacement terminology within both code bases and documentation and communications. So to that note, we have, I think, 3 areas that we're focusing on initially. And we're still getting our feelers out as to what the group would like to see. The first area that we think we're interested in looking at is areas around tooling. So Red Hat has a really great dashboard that they've developed for some of their open source projects to track the instances of certain words in their code bases over time. So we're looking for ideas around tooling and how we can expand potentially what Red Hat has and maybe make it a little more broad speaking. And Rich dropped a link to that in the chat, I believe, which is super helpful. Thank you so much, Rick. So that's kind of stream number 1 that we're looking at. Stream number 2 that we're looking at is around processes and actual recommendations for replaced language. So this is, again, actual recommendations, for example, replacing blacklist, whitelist with allow list, deny list, and unifying our thoughts on that.
I think one thing we actually do have to keep very carefully in mind there, which is it's all well and good if you're an open source project where the thing that you're renaming is actually within your purview exclusively. It is a very different thing, and sadly all too common, that the thing that you're renaming is a thing which you implemented, but which is not actually a thing for which you are authoritative. Many network protocols, many storage protocols, all kinds of things end up falling into that bucket. And so in addition to figuring out sort of terminology that needs to be replaced and potential candidates for replacement, which is extremely useful work,
Mhm.
I think there's a real need to start fostering communities around the things that need to get renamed, so that, if you've got a thing that, for example, on the networking side is implemented in the Linux kernel, DPDK, VPP, standardized by the IEEE, then those parties need to get together around the renaming, because otherwise Linux will name it one thing, VPP will name it a second, DPDK will name it a third, and when the standards body finally comes around, we're all going to be out of compliance. And that's a very serious problem. And I suspect it's not just networking, it's not just storage. I think it's a lot of things. How do we foster those particular communities in terms of enumerating what are the things and who are the constituents we're aware of, and who do we pull together from those constituents to help with settling on a common term so we don't get the Tower of Babel problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And we've kind of talked about this privately, Ed and I, and that's my mother coming home from her morning shift. Say hello, everybody in the background. And the
Apologies for my office manager coming through.
your
by
office
the way.
manager is adorable. No apologies needed. Sorry, I tend to get really distracted by background noise, so I'm struggling right now. Yeah, I think that's a big problem. And I think, let me just run through kind of the last section of like what we're here to talk about, and then let's run through each and take a few more suggestions and a few more questions and kind of start to pick out what our priorities are as a group. So kind of the last area that we're looking at, and I think this is very much Priyanka's heart, is around kind of people and promotion, and how do we start promoting projects and organizations and companies and people who are doing the work and effectively kind of deserve the branding of it. So there's kind of a marketing and a promotions aspect to that as well. First off, does anybody have any questions? And just feel free to kind of unmute yourselves.
So this quick question in terms of the scope, do you see it just looking at the code level, the open source, and I know this is probably on everybody's mind, or much wider, covering are the various industries that we touch on, whether it's marketing terminology or even internal HR, as we've said, blacklist or master plan or those type of things. And, just as a team, how wide do we see this in terms of industry leadership, or, keep it focused? What are some of the thoughts?
Ooh, that's a great question. I can tell you what I think, but I would also love to hear from the room after that. What I think is that our initial scope is probably going to be around code and language very specific to code, because I think that's what will keep us focused enough to drive results. But I think you ask a very interesting question. To give you a bit of background, my background is actually in user experience design, and there are a lot of very problematic aspects of user experience design these days that I think, well, at what point does user experience design become the code base, right? I think for now, it's about what it's about for me. It's about removing harmful and very persistent language from different programming languages and code bases, and therefore the technical documentation as well. Because these things persist, and like Ed alluded to, if you're implementing, for example, Kubernetes actually does quite well in not using blacklist, whitelist until you look at the Go packages for, I think, metrics and monitoring that it imports in every repository that Kubernetes has, in which case then it starts to do very, very poorly across every single repository because the problem is down and Go, right? So I'm interested in those terms. That's what I'm interested in, but let me hear what everybody else has to say in terms of scope.
This is Heather Kirksey. I'm also at the Linux Foundation. I'm the VP of Community and Ecosystem for the LF Networking projects. We just heard from Ed, who works with one of those. And I would say, back to what I think it was Andre who was asking that question, I think that sounds like a very interesting sort of long-term thing. I think in order to avoid boiling the ocean, I think sort of maybe like what's the acute problem that I think Celeste just laid out very well that we want to solve, but it could be possible that this initiative, grows over time as we encounter new issues like that, and can be sort of a force for even broader change, as long as we maybe get to the point of solving some acute problems early on, A, for an early win, and B, to avoid boiling the ocean, which can lead to sort of paralysis and therefore getting nothing done because you want to try to do everything at once.
Yeah. And I think to allude to the boiling the ocean part / what Ed brought up earlier around having to work with standards bodies and just those being historically slow moving institutions to deal with. So we've been talking to actually a few people from the kind of big three standards bodies, the IETF, the W3C, and the IEEE. Our feeling thus far is that it's up to us to make our own choices in our own code bases, insofar as they don't get us into trouble with the standards body. However, because standards bodies are typically slow moving and they tend to want to make recommendations that are widely accepted by the community already, driving this kind of community adoption will have a positive influence on the standards bodies making a recommendation that is in line with what kind of is bubbling up from the ground, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think also there's a point where the code base hits the UIs, and then where the UIs hit the standards terminology. Internal to the code, it really doesn't matter if we're calling something, if we're accessing a structure that is in the standard known by a term we don't want to use, using our own terms in code, as long as it's appropriately commented, et cetera, isn't going to affect anything. But when you cross over into the user experience, and they may be dealing with external documents, including the standards documents that expose those terms, that's a place where, for example, we may carry forward the more inclusive term and footnoted as known in the standard as the other, or something like that. So I think there's this progression. And then once you do that, you also have prior art to take to the standards bodies.
Yeah,
I think you make a good point, Roger, in that standards bodies tend to be conservative for very good reasons, because they're trying to drive consensus in a way that's different than we drive consensus through code. But if most of the major, at least open implementers, show up on their doorstep and say, hey, we've got the kernel, we've got these other half dozen folks, and we think that you should change the term to this. This is what we would suggest. Could you please do it this month? Because there's clearly consensus here among the implementer community that this is the correct change. I don't think we'll get it this month, but we might get it this quarter. Whereas it could take years otherwise. We have a lot of ability, I think, to influence the standards bodies, just because the fact that we come together helps meet one of the core reasons that they move slowly, which is the ability to drive consensus across broad communities.
I totally agree, Ed, and I wanted to jump on that because that's where I love where you were going with that, and plus kind of giving a narrow scope. Having reached out to a lot of other big companies and asked about their program and their effort, the determination of the replacement terms in context, is a challenge that every company is trying to do, and we're misaligned already. You can see what some of the ones that have been shared publicly. But having a group coming together and saying, okay, the slave node term in networking, here's what we commonly have identified as a potential replacement, and going back to the standards body and say, here's a strong voice of some suggested beginning to build out the replacement, I think would help accelerate that. And that's part of the challenge that, yes, we have a list of common alternatives, but that's not really going to help without knowing the context of a CPU process is completely different than.
And let's be really frank, for those of us who are coming from companies that have things we would like to improve in this situation. If we are implementing a standard and we are receiving RFPs that require us to be in compliance with that standard, and the standard is using these terms, we need the standard to change so that we can change. If nobody is going to put themselves into non-compliance and thus unable to sell into the marketplace, just to correct this problem. And so to correct this problem, we have got to move those folks who are definitive about what the names are.
And I think even having a resource, like an early step might be having a resource of here are the some of the things we know about, here's the progress on them, here's the status of them, like which is this particular terminology something that's part of the standard? Is it part of a Linux kernel implementation? Because right now, each one of those requires a lot of digging and reading mailing list threads and whatnot to try to figure out what the state of it is and to figure out how to pursue it. And I think as we've been doing this internally, it's also like there are some good generic, this usually works as replacement terminology cases, like for whitelist, blacklist, the allow list, deny list often works, but oftentimes, for example, from a user, when you dig into what is the system actually doing, deny may not actually be the verb that is applicable. So in some cases, we found that using block list is something better than using deny list, depending upon the context. Or
well, to your point, for example, in most of networking, in ACLs, the terminology used is permit deny. So, permit list, deny list, or that kind of thing is going to be much more natural in that context.
One thing sorry, Ed.
No, please go ahead.
All right. Kevin Stanton, Intel. Jim will be our main representative here. Just wanted to mention a couple things, and I actually need to step off for another meeting. So I think there are a couple things that could be really useful. One is just a survey of organizations that have already made the change of certain of these terminologies. Intel's had a kind of a quiet behind the scenes effort for the last 18 months or a little more. And we've been pushing changes into standards bodies, USB, HDMI, PCI Express, working with the IEEE, networking, other places, as well as there's been some people in the Linux kernel and elsewhere. We put together a package actually for some of the people in the company that have been working in these areas. And I think we have about 40 or 50 standards that we've identified that people are involved in. We're working, and it's a slow burn for sure in the standards. Both a policy statement that's been adopted by some standards organizations that identify a few key terms to change that with a good overlap. And then also a list of replacement terms that we've seen and a little bit of guidance in terms of when this would be used versus that would be used. I think that would be a really great discussion as well, to talk about fewer is better, but descriptive is important. Really to be descriptive in terms of what we're actually trying to communicate with these words. Several of master slaves massively overloaded in the industry, and so we end up with much better clarity when we make these replacements. So I think maybe in a future meeting, I'd be happy, Jim and I could come in and just to share some of the content that we've created internally for our own people. And maybe that could be useful as just at least a discussion.
Yeah, I think that would be super useful. And I'm actually wondering, so this meeting is every 2 weeks, and would the next occurrence of this meeting in 2 weeks be too soon?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, then.
Yeah, we could come in with the list of organizations that have already made the change, what they've changed to.
Yeah.
And then I think with all of you, we could massively expand that list.
Yeah.
And that would also create some kind of a directionality in terms of replacement terms, what's getting the most hits, let's say, for a particular meaning. Let's push behind that set of terms so we don't have more divergence than necessary.
I think that's a really, really great idea. And thank you for letting me volunteer you. But that's something that, so to give a bit of background to some of the new joiners here, Priyanka, Bill, Stephen Augustus, who is in another meeting right now, and Ed and I have been involved in a lot of exploratory meetings over the past few months, kind of reaching out into individual organizations and trying to understand what they're doing. And for me, as a writer, that would be really, really valuable. That's the thing that I've wanted to see. So absolutely, yes, let's kind of make that one of our big agenda items for the next meeting. And then maybe let's kind of keep that ball rolling for the next few meetings with different companies. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, the origins of the effort were, it was, I think, March 2019, where a technical writer, Celeste, as you mentioned, came to their manager and said, I don't want to use this term, but it's in the standard. What do I do? And so I was brought in at the time, and could we replace the word but still reference the term that's used by the standard in our documentation? It was really a focus on, let's make sure the product documentation that goes out from the company doesn't have any of the terms that we think would be non-inclusive. And if necessary, we can have a mapping, use the word once, and say, and in this document we're using that other, a synonym. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't, but that was actually the genesis of this overall effort.
And one thing that might be worth including in that is also cases where companies have decided not to replace terms, and why. Because one of the things we found keeps derailing this is there's so many potential terms that you could bring into scope. And there's some of them very solidly fall into the yes, this really belongs in scope now that we understand what the background of it is. Other ones of them end up being distracting and get used by people to try to people who are not supporters to try and derail it all. Like white space, in terms of like white space in code, is one where when we've dug into it, doesn't seem like something that really needs to change. But at the same time, it gets thrown out by people as an example of, oh, well, if you're changing that, should we change white space too? And having a list of, these are things that there's been enough consensus on, including working with potentially impacted groups, that there's some degree of consensus that maybe it's not worth spending time on trying to change them, can help reduce some of the distractions.
I have, I work for IBM, and we have a few things. We really like the framework that Celeste and a few people have written, and it lays out sort of first order concerns, second order, and third. So we found that a good good frame of reference to go from. But we have a group a diverse group that makes decisions about terms, and we have a form that people can fill out to send us terms. And we post everything that we've discussed in a list with the rationale. So for example, with white space, a bunch of people submitted it, and we have it in our list of terms that we've considered with, the reason why. We have a clear rationale for like a guiding principle for white and black terms. And so we explain that, and we say, this is why, white space doesn't fall into the list of terms that are a problem.
Mm-hmm. So here's maybe a follow-up for you, Carla. And sorry if I'm getting a little jumpy towards the end of the year, is there a way that your group can consider open sourcing that list? Because this sounds like a very interesting list to me. And I think, and just speaking from my perspective again as a writer, like IBM has been a very long time leader in the field of technical writing. Like it is very much, it's a thing that technical writers know. So I would be interested in seeing that list, but I understand that it may be kind of an internal thing for now.
Well, it's interesting you say this, because this morning I've been reviewing with Dale and with our legal counsel, our communications people, a version of the list. But what we're providing you with is the terms that we've decided not to use anymore. Mm-hmm. And we're providing the guiding principles and the rationales for each of them. But we didn't think to include the stuff that we reviewed and concluded was fine. And if this is something that's also going to be interesting, then I can go back and see if maybe we can squeak that past the lawyers as well.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting.
It's definitely interesting.
Yeah. Also, just as an FYI, my Zoom account is not yet a pro account. I submitted the upgrade request this morning, 5 minutes before this meeting. So this meeting's going to end in about 9 minutes, and I have no control over that. But hopefully for the next meeting, it will be sorted out. Just FYI.
So,
hey, Celeste, can you hear me? This is Dale.
I can. Hi.
Hi, my audio wasn't working before. Yeah, so the goal was by today to have all the internal approvals for what we submitted out there. But we've already created a repo that a Git repo to share, and I really like the idea of adding the terms we have not used to, I think it was Eric's point, and why, right? Which ones have we not? Which, by the way, includes some instances of master, right? Because master data management, we don't see anything there that is biased. So it'd be interesting to, we have that. We should have that available, we hope, by this week.
Okay, cool.
And then you can point to it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be super cool. And I think just to not wrap up, but something to note for all of you is I think a really good way to end off this year for all of us is if we can figure out what resources in our own companies are currently available that we can point to centrally from the Inclusive Naming Initiative in some way, shape, or form. Because I think we've got some like longer work streams that are going to take a little bit longer to accomplish, but I think let's gather our resources. I think per I'm sorry, I'm just like looking back in the notes to see who I can attribute it to. It was Jim and I believe somebody else from IBM who mentioned the same point of doing a survey of people who've already made the changes, what they've made the change to, and kind of what the end results were. I think that's kind of a good end of year thing that we can accomplish. And yeah.
I think, Celeste, I'll throw in when we talked a little bit about the scope and where Carla and Dale were going. I think one of the objectives of this group could be, or just proposed, is sharing and open sourcing that list of what terms are in scope. What have we collectively said, let's go after? Which are the ones that we've said are like master data management, so it's a perfect example, or master plan, which are ones that have been evaluated. Even having that available that other companies can begin to point to, and it's in a public place, it's off the site, or whatever, that right there is going to have a big impact on all the other companies that are beginning to do it, to have a place to be able to look at, well, wait a minute, we're going after these 6 terms, but these other companies are going after these 12 terms or whatever, and that's something that's achievable from the various input from, all the different participants.
Yeah. And I like the idea of having, links to it. I mean, I'm going to cross-reference in our Git repo the other places where people are talking, but eventually it'd be nice to wrap up the year with a list with the rationale for whatever decisions we've made. I don't know if everybody likes that approach, but I do think it would help for others who are coming in new to this to understand not just what decisions the companies have made, but if the answer is no, it's we're not going to change it. Why did we make the decision not to? So we just added a column called rationale or reason for the decision. And I think if everybody had that, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, I think that would be fantastic. I'd also like to get that from some of the open source projects and standards bodies as well, so that we have sort of a broader representation to the degree that they have such things. I know some projects are much more involved in this than others. The other thing I would really like to try and figure out how to get going, and I think Eric touched on this briefly before we moved on, is how are we going to start putting together the list of the things and the different entities who have to interact to properly rename the things? Because that's one that sort of cries out for, oh, there you are. Your image moved as people left and joined, and I lost track of you on the little gallery, Eric. So, because that one is going to take a little while to put together. And we just need to figure out how to describe it out. And like, I have this picture in my head, and don't read anything terribly much into the picture, where you've got a Google sheet with tabs for sort of general technology areas, and you've got a row per thing, and you can start listing out the terms that need to be replaced on that thing and the entities involved and the contact people we're working with in each of those organizations, or that we need to go find. So you can start bringing together these micro communities around the particular thing. Because quite frankly, most of the people who are going to actually have to put hands, agree on what the changes are for a particular thing and put hands on code, they're never going to make this meeting. And that's actually fantastic, right? But we do need them to get together amongst themselves.
Okay. I kind of agree. And I think, so I put somewhere in the notes, a to-do for myself, which is, I think, one of my takeaways and next steps from this meeting is to send out a survey to the mailing list and to start identifying kind of what verticals of tech people are working in, so that we can start to tease apart who's going to be involved in defining what sets of changes, and like how do we then reach into the communities that they need to be involved in. Because I think you're correct, Ed. I think there's definitely I think we're going to need to start splintering off into work streams eventually. Like, as much as I love seeing all of your faces here, and thank you all for joining, it will prove, I suspect, impractical. And just to give a warning, I have about 3 minutes left on my free Zoom account for now. So I'm going to take Charles because he has his hand up for a question. And then I think I'm going to ask for kind of a final round. Charles.
Yeah, thank you. So I just caught the tail end of the mini statement that a lot of people who need to be doing stuff will not be able to make most of these calls, which is true. I'm literally running out of doing a bunch of things where I work in medical robotics to come and join this, because I've had it in my calendar. It's been popping up, and I had something literally fall in my lap, so I had to finish that. It doesn't mean we're not interested or we don't want to join. We do. It's just, life dictates. So we do want to, I literally ran, I don't know if you can see the sweat on my forehead, to get to a spot where I could sit down and not have noise to participate. So it is hard to participate in these while also working. I did set aside time, and then there was an emergency, so someone didn't show up. So there's definitely, I think, an interest to participate in these things for certain. And
I'm just going to cut you
right,
off
we do
because
have to split.
there's like less than a minute. Okay. Thank you all for showing up. Any further questions from this can go to the inclusive naming mailing list, which I'm going to paste in the chat now and also paste in the notes shortly. If, like Rich, you have specific suggestions of words to validate, open an issue in the GitHub repo, because then we can track it and then we can put it on a project board and then we can assign people to it. Thank you all so much. I apologize for my Zoom account. The recording of this meeting, when we decide where to put it, will be up on YouTube, and I will email the mailing list with that as well. Thank you so much. I'm going to cut it off before Zoom cuts me off, and I'm going to end this recording.
Thank you.
Thank you.